Athena, the youngest daughter, is left with her father's rusted, worthless backlot junkyard, while her siblings strip the estate of its visible wealth. Athena wants to preserve her father's dignity and find one last connection to the man the world called a failure. Her siblings move to sell the land to developers, giving Athena only 72 hours to clear the trash before the bulldozers arrive. Under a series of industrial acid-etched tarps, Athena uncovers a precision-engineered, self-sustaining modular home prototype. The junkyard is revealed as a revolutionary architectural laboratory, securing Athena's fortune and cementing her father's legacy as a true genius. They laughed when she walked away with nothing but the rusted back lot and a pile of scrap. While her siblings were busy fighting over the classic cars and the cold, hard cash, they left Athena with what they called the shame of the family junkyard. They saw a graveyard of twisted metal and failure, but they didn't know the truth about what was actually breathing beneath the layers of grime and neglect. Underneath the heavy, silver-threaded tarp sat a secret that would eventually make the family mansion look like a plastic dollhouse. What did her father really hide in the mud, and why did he die protecting it? Now, to understand how a pile of junk became a miracle, we have to go back to the day the vultures started circling. See, my father, Elias, was a man who spoke in the language of machines. To the neighbors, he was just the guy who kept a messy yard at the edge of town. To my brother Marcus and my sister Claire, he was an embarrassment. A man who spent his final years tinkering with garbage instead of building a real portfolio. When the cancer took him, the mourning lasted about as long as it took for the lawyer to open his briefcase. We sat in that mahogany office, the air thick with the smell of expensive cologne and greed. When the lawyer read the part about the backlot, the 5 acres of swampy land filled with rusted husks and old machinery, they practically shoved the deed into my hands. They saw trash, but I saw home. And beneath that dirt, a masterpiece was waiting for the light of day. Stay with me, because the truth about this property will leave you speechless. This wasn't just a junkyard, it was a vault, and the key was hidden in the one place my siblings were too proud to look. The ink on the deed wasn't even dry before the masks began to slip. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He'd secured the 3 classic cars and the liquid assets, the real wealth, as he called it. Claire had the suburban house and the jewelry. Their contempt was barely concealed beneath their polite smiles. To them, the back lot was a toxic liability, a scar on the family name that they were more than happy to amputate. "You always were Dad's favorite, Athena," Claire said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary sympathy. "It's only right you keep the place you spent so much time in. Just don't expect us to help you haul away the scrap metal when the city inspectors start knocking." Marcus didn't even bother with the pleasantries. He pulled a thick, glossy folder from his briefcase and slapped it onto the mahogany table. It was a contract with Apex Urban Development, a company known for turning historic land into gray concrete blocks. He'd already signed a preliminary agreement to sell the adjoining acreage, but there was a catch. The developers wanted the entire perimeter cleared. They didn't want a shanty town of rusted steel ruining the view of their new luxury condos. "You have 72 hours, Athena," Marcus said, his tone turning cold and professional. "The bulldozers are scheduled for Monday morning at 8 sharp. I've already authorized them to level anything left on that lot. If you want to save any of Dad's treasures, you better start digging tonight. Otherwise, it all goes into the crusher." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They weren't just taking the money. They were trying to erase the very ground my father had walked on. They wanted to pave over his memory because it didn't fit their aesthetic. That afternoon, I drove out to the lot. It sat at the very edge of the county line, hidden behind a tall, chain-link fence topped with rusted coils of barbed wire. To a stranger, it looked like a graveyard. Old tractor parts, skeletal frames of forgotten engines, and stacks of industrial crates were scattered across the uneven terrain. I moved my small, battered travel trailer onto the site that evening. The air smelled of damp earth and old oil, a scent that usually brought me comfort, but now felt like a heavy shroud. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the metal heaps, the yard revealed its secrets slowly. Then, the humming started. I followed the sound to a small, unassuming shed near the gate. When I pried the door open, I didn't find old lawnmowers. I found a state-of-the-art power grid. A bank of high-end lithium batteries sat neatly on racks, fed by hidden solar filaments woven into the very fencing that surrounded the property. The system was live. It was drawing massive amounts of power and routing it deep into the center of the yard. Why would a failed mechanic keep a high-end security system running on a lot filled with junk? Why was the power bill being paid through a blind trust Dad had set up years ago? I stood there in the dark, the cooling metal around me groaning as the temperature dropped. My siblings thought they had left me with a burden, but as the security cameras silently pivoted to track my movement, I realized they had actually left me at the gates of a fortress. The first light of dawn crawled over the jagged horizon of steel, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mud. I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent the night huddled over a small camping lantern, my fingers stained with the black grease of 1,000 forgotten machines. To my siblings, this was a graveyard of failure. But as I began to move the smaller piles of scrap, I realized the junk was actually a sophisticated filing system. Every rusted manifold and bent axle was tagged with a small, weather-resistant plastic tie. They weren't serial numbers, they were coordinates. By 6 a.m., I had cleared the path to the old tool chest Dad kept bolted to the floor of his workshop. It was a heavy, cast-iron beast that looked like it had survived a war. The lock didn't take a key. It took a specific sequence of pressure on the handle, a tactile code he'd taught me when I was 6 years old. When the lid finally groaned open, the smell of cedar and old paper wafted out, cutting through the scent of diesel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 leather-bound journals. These weren't the ramblings of a hoarder. I turned the pages with trembling hands, finding hundreds of pages of complex blueprints, thermal calculations, and chemical formulas for soil reclamation. My father hadn't been collecting trash. He'd been harvesting specific alloys from industrial waste to build something the world said was impossible. He called them living machines, structures that didn't just sit on the earth, but breathed with it. The journals detailed a way to turn a toxic landscape into a self-sustaining Eden using nothing but the materials already present in the dirt. As I sat there, lost in his sketches of modular joints and solar-integrated glass, a black SUV pulled up to the chain-link gate. A man stepped out, wearing a suit that cost more than my trailer. He introduced himself as Mr. Vance, a private collector representing an anonymous group of investors. He didn't look at the scrap. He looked at the ground beneath my feet with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "Miss Athena?" he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "I know this is a difficult time. Your brother mentioned you might need help clearing this eyesore. My clients are prepared to offer you $50,000 in cash right now. We'll bring our own crews, haul everything away by noon, and you can walk away with a clean slate. You won't even have to lift a finger." $50,000. To someone living in a trailer with a 72-hour eviction notice, it was a fortune. But then I saw the way his eyes flicked toward the central mound near the creek, the one covered in the heavy, silver-threaded tarps. He wasn't looking at the metal. He was looking at the secret. "The trash isn't for sale," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Vance's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned cold. "Athena, be reasonable. This land is a biohazard. By Monday, the city will fine you into bankruptcy. Take the money while the offer is still on the table. My clients don't like to wait, and they certainly don't like to lose." He left a card on the fence post and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that tasted like copper. I realized then that my father wasn't just shielding a breakthrough. He was hiding it from people who wanted to weaponize it or bury it forever. He had built a fortress of rust to protect a miracle of light. I looked back at the journals. The diagrams pointed toward the creek, to the very spot Vance had been eyeing. Beneath the rot, a miracle was waiting. But I wasn't the only one who knew it was there. The silence of the junkyard was never truly silent. It was a symphony of metal contracting in the cool night air, the rustling of dry weeds, and the distant hum of the hidden power grid I'd discovered earlier. But at 2 in the morning, a new sound cut through the darkness. The low, guttural growl of heavy diesel engines. I sat up in my trailer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the thin curtains, I saw the sweeping arcs of headlights cutting through the fog. They weren't coming for the gate. They were coming through the perimeter fence near the back lot. A flatbed truck and 2 white vans rumbled onto the property, their tires churning the soft mud. Men in dark tactical gear spilled out, moving with a mechanical precision that didn't belong to a simple junk removal crew. They didn't head for the workshop or the tool chest. They went straight for the creek. They were heading for the central mound, the one covered in the heavy silver-threaded tarps that had remained untouched for years. My father's secret was being hunted, and the vultures had sent their wolves to claim it before the sun could rise. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I grabbed the heavy iron wrench from my bedside table and sprinted towards my father's old D9 bulldozer. It was a rusted behemoth, a relic of a bygone era that looked like it hadn't moved since the 90s. But I knew better. I knew Dad had spent his final months tinkering with its internal guts. I climbed into the cab, the cold leather seat biting through my clothes. I flipped the ignition sequence exactly as the journals had described. Pressure, turn, then a steady hold. The engine didn't just start, it roared to life with a ferocious, healthy thrum that shook the very ground beneath me. I slammed the lever forward, and the massive steel tracks bit into the earth. I wasn't just driving a machine, I was steering a shield. The intruders scrambled as I swung the heavy blade around, positioning the bulldozer directly between their trucks and the tarp-covered mound. One of the men, a tall figure with a jagged scar across his chin, stepped forward and leveled a high-powered flashlight at my face. He didn't look like a mover. He looked like a mercenary. "Move the rig, lady," he shouted over the roar of the engine. "We have a work order to clear this specific hazard. Don't make this a police matter." "Show me the order," I yelled back, my hands white-knuckled on the controls. "Otherwise you're trespassing on private property, and this blade doesn't care about your suit-and-tie bosses." The tension was a physical weight in the air. For a moment I thought they would try to board the cab, but then the jagged scar man looked at the bulldozer. Really looked at it. He saw the custom modifications, the reinforced hydraulics, and the way the machine moved with a fluid grace that defied its age. He realized I wasn't just a grieving daughter. I was an obstacle he hadn't been paid enough to dismantle. He signaled to his crew, and with a series of sharp commands, they retreated into their vans. The diesel engines faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the vibrating cab of the D9. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pull the kill switch. They would be back, and next time, they wouldn't bring flashlights. I jumped down into the mud and ran toward the mound. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the edge of the silver-threaded tarp and pulled. The heavy fabric slid away, revealing not the rusted iron I expected, but a shimmering aerospace-grade chrome surface that reflected the moonlight like a mirror. The silver tarp fell away like the skin of a giant, revealing a structure that defied everything I knew about my father's life. It wasn't a heap of scrap or a collection of spare parts. Standing before me was a sleek, aerodynamic pod of shimmering chrome and reinforced glass. I spent the next 4 hours in a fever, hauling a high-pressure hose from the workshop and blasting away decades of tactical grime and intentional camouflage. As the mud and the grey sealant dissolved into the earth, the true shape of the object emerged. It was a seed house, a revolutionary, fully collapsible modular home that looked like it had been plucked from a century in the future. The exterior was a masterpiece of engineering. The walls were composed of a self-healing polymer chrome alloy, designed to deflect heat and harvest kinetic energy from the wind. I walked around the perimeter, my boots squelching in the puddles, until I found a small, recessed panel near the base. It was a keypad, hidden behind a sliding metal plate.
My father never trusted digital clouds or remote servers. He trusted memory. I thought back to the journals, to the way he'd circled my birthday in the margins of every blueprint. I entered the 6 digits, and the air around the structure hissed as the internal pressure equalized. A door, perfectly flush with the wall, slid open with a whisper. I stepped inside, and the darkness was immediately replaced by a soft, warm, amber glow. The interior was a shock to the senses. After living in a cramped, drafty trailer and breathing the metallic dust of the yard, the air inside the seed house felt pure, filtered through a complex botanical wall that lined the rear of the unit.
The junk my siblings had mocked was actually the raw material for a masterpiece of luxury and efficiency. The floors were polished reclaimed oak, the countertops were recycled industrial glass that glowed from within, and every square inch of the space was optimized for a life of quiet, sustainable dignity. On the central table, a slab of petrified wood found in the very creek that bordered the lot, sat a thick, waterproof envelope. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were the original patent papers, stamped and verified by the federal office but never made public. My father had bypassed the traditional corporate channels, knowing they would bury his invention to protect their own profits. He had filed the patents under a private trust, listing me, Athena, as the sole beneficiary and the protector of the prototype. But the house was only half the miracle. Taped to the interior window was a map of the junkyard itself. It wasn't just a map of where the metal was buried. It was a schematic for the soil. I realized then that the living machine wasn't just the house. The entire 5-acre lot was a massive, decentralized filtration system. The rusted tractor parts and the skeletal engines were strategically placed to leach specific minerals into the ground, neutralizing decades of industrial runoff. My father hadn't been hoarding trash. He'd been performing a slow-motion alchemy, turning a toxic wasteland into the most valuable piece of ecologically restored land in the state. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light through the high-performance glass, I saw the first of the developer's trucks appearing at the gate. The 72 hours were up. I sat down on the reclaimed oak floor, the patent papers clutched to my chest, and waited for the mask to finally fall away. The morning air was unnervingly still as the first yellow bulldozer rumbled to the gate. It looked like a prehistoric beast, its heavy steel blade scraping against the asphalt with a sound that set my teeth on edge. Behind it, a caravan of black SUVs and white pickup trucks filled the narrow access road. My brother Marcus stepped out of the lead vehicle, looking every bit the corporate shark in a tailored navy suit that seemed absurdly out of place against the backdrop of rusted iron and red mud. Claire was right behind him, shielding her eyes with oversized designer sunglasses, her expression one of practiced boredom mixed with a simmering, impatient disdain. "Time's up, Athena," Marcus shouted, his voice amplified by a megaphone he'd grabbed from one of the construction foremen. "The 72 hours expired at 8 a.m. sharp. I've got the Apex Urban Development crew here to start the clearing. Move your trailer and get out of the way before we have to call the sheriff to physically remove you." I didn't move. I stood on the porch of the seed house, the chrome surface behind me catching the morning sun and throwing a blinding, heavenly light across the muddy yard. The construction crew hesitated, their engines idling in a low, rhythmic growl. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the shimmering, aerodynamic structure that seemed to have materialized out of the grime overnight. The foreman, a burly man with a weathered face, climbed down from his rig and walked toward the fence, his eyes wide with a mix of professional curiosity and genuine awe. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, ignoring Marcus's frantic gesturing. "It's a prototype," I said, my voice steady and clear. "And it's private property. This land isn't a junkyard anymore, Marcus. It's a registered laboratory for sustainable architecture." Claire let out a sharp, jagged laugh as she stepped toward the gate. "A laboratory? Athena, don't be ridiculous. It's a shiny tin can sitting in a swamp. Dad was a hoarder, not an inventor. Everything on this land belongs to the estate, and as the executors, Marcus and I have already signed the demolition order. That, whatever it is,
is just more scrap for the crusher.
Marcus nodded, his face hardening into a mask of cold efficiency. She's right. The deed you hold is for the land, but the assets of the estate, including all industrial materials, are under our control until the final distribution. This structure was built using estate resources. We're taking it down, and we're taking it now. Foreman, level the site. The foreman looked from the shimmering house to the scowling man in the suit, then back to me. He was a man who understood the value of good steel, and he could see that this wasn't junk. But a contract was a contract. He turned back toward his machine, his hand reaching for the lever. "Wait!" I yelled, pulling a laminated document from the waterproof envelope. "You might want to read the secondary deed first. My father knew you'd try this, Marcus. He knew you'd only see the surface, but he patented the dirt." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus snatched the papers through the chain-link fence, his eyes scanning the technical jargon with growing panic. It wasn't just a patent for the seed house, it was a patent for a specific microbial soil reclamation process that utilized the very scrap they wanted to remove. The land wasn't a toxic liability, it was a self-cleaning ecosystem that had already reached peak environmental certification. By destroying the junk, they would be destroying a patented multi-million-dollar ecological asset. The vultures had traded a gold mine for a few used cars, and the mask of their superiority was finally shattering. The legal team arrived within the hour, confirming what Marcus and Claire refused to believe. My siblings stood frozen as the developers sheepishly retracted their bid. They had spent their lives chasing the shine of polished chrome, never realizing the real gold was hidden beneath the rust they despised. I spent the following months transforming the yard into the Elias Research Center. We don't just build houses here, we grow them. In the back of the seed house, I found one last letter tucked into a structural beam. It read, "They looked at the surface, Athena. You looked at the soul. Use this well." Today, the shimmering prototype stands as a beacon where the scrap piles once rotted. My siblings are left with depreciating cars and empty bank accounts, while the worthless dirt they threw away has become the blueprint for a sustainable future. Dad knew exactly who to trust with the future. Sometimes the greatest treasures are covered in things others are too proud to touch. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story.